Hi, welcome my channel. Valeria Knight was abandoned, but now she reigns. Tonight, at a grand gala, betrayal meets justice, lies crumble, secrets burn, the reckoning begins. Are you ready? Let's dive in. The rain pounded against the pavement, cold and relentless, soaking through Valeria Knight's thin sweater as she stood outside the grand estate she once called home. The towering iron gates loomed behind her, shutting her out, severing her from everything she had ever known. The finality of it all was deafening. Her father, Jonathan Knight, stood on the front steps, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, cold, indifferent, as if she was nothing more than a minor inconvenience he was finally rid of. "You're 18, he said flatly, an adult. You figure it out." Beside him, her mother, Eleanor, didn't even spare her a glance. She adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist, sighing as if this entire ordeal was exhausting. "It's for the best," she murmured, voice detached. "You were never meant for this life." But it was Sophia, her older sister, who delivered the final blow. Standing in the doorway, wrapped in a designer coat, she smirked, pleased, triumphant. "You'll never be anything," she whispered. "You were always the disappointment." The door slammed shut. The world fell silent. Valeria stood frozen, her breath visible in the icy night air, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of their words pressed down on her, suffocating. No money, no shelter, no one to turn to. She was utterly alone. She clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms until the pain cut through the shock. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. They wanted her to disappear, to fade into nothingness, to prove them right. But she wouldn't. No, she couldn't. She would survive. She would rise. She would become something they would never expect. With one last look at the mansion, she turned on her heel and walked into the night, rain trailing behind her like ghostly echoes of her past. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this night wouldn't be the end of her story. It would be the beginning of her reckoning. 14 years later, Valeria Knight stepped into the grand ballroom of the Astoria Hotel, her presence commanding the space before she had even spoken a word. The room was a spectacle of wealth and power. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over elegantly dressed executives. The hum of polite conversation punctuated by the delicate clink of champagne flutes. Every detail of the evening screamed exclusivity, a place reserved only for those who belonged to the world of corporate elite. And tonight, she belonged here more than anyone. Draped in a custom-made black evening gown that hugged her figure with effortless elegance, Valeria moved with quiet confidence. No longer the abandoned girl in the rain, now she was a force, a billionaire tech mogul, CEO of Titan Innovations, the woman who built an empire from nothing. The irony was almost poetic. This very gala, held in honor of the merger between Reed Global and Knight Enterprises, was meant to celebrate the continued dominance of her former family's business. A business that, after tonight, would never be the same again. Her eyes swept across the room, pausing when she found them. Jonathan and Eleanor Knight stood near the grand staircase, dressed impeccably, basking in the attention of their elite peers. Sophia Knight, the golden child, stood in the center of it all, smiling for the cameras, her diamond engagement ring catching the light as she laughed at something her fiancé, Nathaniel Reed, whispered into her ear. They had no idea. They didn't recognize her, not yet. Valeria smirked. They had erased her from their lives, convinced she was nothing more than a forgotten mistake. They had no idea that the woman standing before them, the woman they had discarded like trash, was not only their equal, but their superior. She had spent years watching them from afar, collecting every thread of their corruption, waiting for the perfect moment to pull it all apart. And that moment? It was now. Just as she stepped toward the center of the ballroom, Sophia's gaze landed on her. For a split second, her sister's smile faltered, her brow creasing in mild confusion. Then, as if dismissing a passing stranger, she turned away. Valeria's smirk widened. Soon enough, Sophia would wish she had paid attention. Soon enough, they would all know exactly who she was. She reached for a passing waiter's champagne glass, lifting it slightly as if to toast the night. Let the games begin. Valeria moved through the crowd with effortless poise, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she approached the center of the ballroom. The air was thick with money and power. The kind of space where only the most privileged thrived. A place where, 14 years ago, she was told she would never belong. And yet, here she was, not as an outcast, but as the one about to burn it all down. She stopped just a few feet from where Sophia Knight and Nathaniel Reed stood, their laughter ringing through the room like a carefully curated performance. The golden child, as smug and untouchable as ever, basked in the attention of high-profile executives and socialites. For years, Sophia had lived under the illusion that she was the perfect daughter, the accomplished businesswoman, the one who carried the Knight legacy. Tonight, that illusion would shatter. Valeria tilted her head slightly, waiting for the moment of recognition. And there it was. Sophia's eyes met hers, the easy confidence on her face faltering for just a heartbeat. Confusion flickered in her expression, her lips parting slightly as if her mind was trying to place the woman standing before her. Then, as expected, the sneer returned. "I think you're at the wrong event," Sophia said, crossing her arms, her voice dripping with condescension. "This isn't some charity banquet for the less fortunate." A quiet murmur rippled through the surrounding guests, eyes darting between the two women. Valeria only smiled. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be," she said smoothly, lifting her champagne flute to her lips. Sophia let out a short, amused breath, her gaze flicking over Valeria's gown as if assessing whether it was borrowed or stolen. "And you are?" Valeria tilted her head, dragging out the silence, making her wait, let the tension stretch just enough to sink its claws into the moment. Then, slowly, she lowered her glass, her eyes locking onto Sophia's. "My name is Valeria Knight." The room stilled. Sophia's smirk disappeared, her face paled instantly. Jonathan Knight, who had been mid-conversation with another executive, whipped around at the sound of her name. Eleanor, ever the composed matriarch, went rigid, her manicured nails tightening around her champagne glass. The recognition hit them all at once. Like a slow-moving wreck they couldn't stop. Valeria let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment settle in. Then she smirked. "Did you miss me?" Sophia recovered first, scoffing as she flipped her hair over her shoulder. "Oh, this is rich," she said, laughing, though the nervous twitch in her jaw betrayed her. "What are you doing here? Trying to beg your way back into the family?" "Because, sweetheart, that ship sailed a long time ago." Valeria took a slow step forward, watching Sophia's confidence crack, piece by piece. "Funny," she murmured. "I was about to ask you the same thing. Are you begging your way into a new life, Sophia? Because last time I checked." She pulled a folded document from her clutch, holding it up just enough for the closest guests to see. "You never actually finished business school, did you?" The color drained from Sophia's face. Nathaniel, who had been silent up until now, furrowed his brow as he glanced between Valeria and the paper in her hand. "What is she talking about?" Sophia let out a short, breathless laugh, but it didn't hold the same confidence as before. "She's lying," she said quickly. "She's always been bitter, desperate." Valeria cut her off with a quiet chuckle. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, tilting her head. "I came prepared." She unfolded the document with precision, her perfectly manicured fingers smoothing out the crisp paper. The official letterhead at the top gleamed under the chandelier lights. A university expulsion notice. Signed. Dated. Proof. A hush fell over the room. Sophia's breath hitched. Nathaniel reached out, snatching the paper from Valeria's hand. His eyes darted across the words, his face growing increasingly rigid with every line he read. His grip on the document tightened. "Sophia," he said, his voice dangerously low, "tell me this isn't true." Sophia floundered, shaking her head. It's not what it looks like." Nathaniel turned toward her fully, his expression unreadable, but the betrayal in his eyes was unmistakable. The whispers in the ballroom grew louder. Executives, investors, people who had placed their trust in Sophia Knight, were beginning to connect the dots. Valeria smiled. The first crack had formed. And soon, the entire Knight empire would crumble. The night Valeria Knight was thrown out, she had exactly $17.28 in her pocket. Not enough for a motel room. Barely enough for food. The rain had seeped into her clothes, chilling her to the bone as she wandered the empty streets, the neon lights of the city flickering like ghosts of a life that no longer belonged to her. She had no plan, no safety net, just the weight of her family's final words ringing in her ears. "You'll never be anything." Those words clung to her, an anchor threatening to pull her under. But even as she shivered in the cold, she made a silent promise to herself. They think I'll disappear, they think I'll fail, but they have no idea who they just abandoned. For 3 nights, she slept behind a rundown diner, curled up near the kitchen vents where the heat from inside kept her from freezing. On the 4th morning, Rita, the diner's sharp-eyed owner, found her. Valeria braced for the worst, for the police to be called, for another door to slam in her face. But instead, Rita tossed a broom at her feet and said, "If you're gonna loiter, you might as well be useful." That broom became her first break. She scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and wiped down greasy countertops for under-the-table cash. It wasn't much, but it was something. She saved every cent, while other teenagers spent their nights partying or scrolling through their phones. Valeria spent hers at the library, sneaking in after work to teach herself business strategies, finance, and coding. She read everything she could get her hands on, economics textbooks, online courses, anything that could sharpen her mind. By 19, she had talked her way into a community college scholarship. It wasn't Harvard, but it was a start. During the day, she attended classes. At night, she took on side hustles, building websites, fixing computers, even tutoring students for extra cash. Every dollar she earned, she invested back into herself. By 21, she landed an unpaid internship at a struggling tech startup. The company was small, ignored by the industry giants, on the verge of collapse. But Valeria saw opportunity where others saw failure. She didn't just fetch coffee, she studied the company's weaknesses, its blind spots, its potential. Within months, she was suggesting strategies that saved them from bankruptcy. By the time she was 23, she wasn't just an intern, she was running entire projects. At 25, she had her first major breakthrough, an artificial intelligence software that streamlined corporate financial predictions. Something that shattered industry norms. She took a risk, pitched her idea to an investor, and within a year, she had secured millions in funding. By 27, Titan Innovations was born. It started as a small firm, just Valeria and a handful of people who believed in her vision. But she worked harder than anyone, 14-hour days, sleepless nights, non-stop hustle. She understood the market, the players, the game. She outmaneuvered them all. Within 5 years, Titan Innovations wasn't just successful, it was a powerhouse. By 32, she was a billionaire. She had done it, without her family, without their money, without their name. And the best part? They had no idea. For 14 years, the Knights lived under the illusion that Valeria had disappeared, that she had faded into the background. Just another failure swept under the rug. They had continued their lives as if she had never existed. They had no idea that while they were laughing at their fancy dinner parties, she was building an empire. They had no idea that the girl they threw away had become a woman they should have feared. Now, standing in the middle of their grand gala, they would finally learn the truth. The silence in the ballroom was suffocating. The weight of Valeria's name still hung in the air, leaving Sophia Knight frozen in place. Her smile long gone, the confidence she had carried all night, the effortless charm she wielded like a weapon, was cracking right before everyone's eyes. But Valeria wasn't finished, not yet. She had waited 14 years for this moment, and she wasn't going to waste it. With deliberate ease, she reached into her sleek clutch and pulled out a folded document. "You know, Sophia," she began, her voice smooth, unhurried, "I couldn't help but notice how often your name is mentioned in investment circles. A rising star in finance. Isn't that right?" She tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "But something about that never quite sat right with me. Because, correct me if I'm wrong?" She unfolded the paper and held it up. "You never actually graduated from business school, did you?" The reaction was instant. A hush swept across the ballroom, rippling through the elegantly dressed crowd like a cold wind. Eyes darted toward Sophia, whispers already beginning to spread. Sophia's face drained of color. Her manicured fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne flute, her entire body rigid. "What is this?" Nathaniel Reed, her fiancé, frowned as he snatched the paper from Valeria's hand. His eyes scanned the document, his expression growing darker with every passing second. The room held its breath as he read the undeniable truth. Valeria Knight, the so-called financial prodigy, had been expelled from university for academic dishonesty. Sophia forced a laugh, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "This is ridiculous," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "Valeria has always been bitter. Always desperate for attention. She probably had this forged just to embarrass me." Valeria smirked. Exactly the reaction she had expected. "Oh, Sophia," she sighed, shaking her head. "I knew you'd say that." She reached into her bag again, pulling out another document, "which is why I made sure to verify with the university itself." She tossed the sealed letter onto a nearby table, where one of the guests, a well-known financial journalist, eagerly picked it up. "You were expelled, Sophia. You never finished your degree. And yet, you've been claiming to be a certified investment banker all these years." A stunned gasp rippled through the crowd. Executives, investors, and high-profile guests, people who had trusted Sophia, who had given her their money, their deals, their faith, were now watching her crumble in real time. "Sophia," Nathaniel's voice was low, controlled, but filled with something dangerously close to betrayal. He turned to her, holding up the document. "Tell me this isn't true." Sophia's lips parted, but no words came out. Valeria could see the panic in her sister's eyes, the desperation as her carefully curated world started to collapse. This was not how tonight was supposed to go for her. She was supposed to be the perfect bride to be, the financial genius. She was supposed to shine. Instead, she was being exposed as a fraud. Sophia's voice broke, her hands trembling as she reached for Nathaniel. "I was going to tell you. I swear, it's not what it looks like." Nathaniel took a step back. His face, once filled with adoration for the woman he planned to marry, was now etched with disgust. "Not what it looks like," he repeated, his voice laced with anger. "You built an entire career on a lie." "I had to," Sophia snapped, panic lacing her voice now. "You don't understand, Dad needed me to." Jonathan Knight's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with warning. "Too late." Valeria smiled. She could already see the second layer of lies unraveling. Sophia clamped her mouth shut, realizing she had said too much. But Nathaniel wasn't stupid. His gaze flicked between Sophia and Jonathan, piecing it together. "This wasn't just you, was it?" His voice dropped to something sharp. "Lethal. This was your father, too." Jonathan tensed, but before he could speak, Valeria leaned in just slightly, her voice a purr of satisfaction. "Oh, it's much worse than you think, Nathaniel." She tapped the paper still clutched in his hand. "Because lying about her degree is one thing, but the fraudulent investment deal she's been making under your firm's name? That's a federal crime." Sophia physically swayed. The whispers around the room were deafening now. Valeria turned her gaze toward Gerald Sinclair, a top banking regulator, who had been silently watching from the edge of the crowd. She caught his eye, raised a brow, and saw the exact moment he realized what she was saying. Gerald turned to Jonathan, his face deadly serious. "Is this true?" Jonathan opened his mouth, but Valeria cut him off before he could lie. "Maybe we should ask the SEC," she mused, pulling one final envelope from her clutch. She handed it to Gerald with a satisfied smirk. "I believe they'll be very interested in the fake investment accounts Sophia has been running through Knight Enterprises." Gasps erupted. Sophia let out a strangled noise, staggering back as if the weight of the room was suffocating her. Her perfect image was shattering, and she knew it. But Valeria? She just watched. Because this was just the beginning. The tension in the ballroom was suffocating, the weight of Sophia's exposed fraud still hanging in the air. But Valeria wasn't done, not yet. Her sister was just the opening act. The real show was about to begin. Jonathan Knight, always the picture of power and control, was pale now, his fingers twitching at his side as if already calculating an escape. Valeria could see the exact moment he realized what was coming, the way his jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward the exits, toward his business partners, toward his wife, but there was nowhere left to run. She took a deliberate step forward, letting the silence stretch, letting him sweat. "You know, Dad," she said smoothly, her voice carrying across the stunned room. "Sophia's situation is unfortunate. But it's hardly surprising. After all, she learned from the best. Jonathan's eyes snapped to hers. The barely contained fury behind them, a sharp contrast to the carefully curated confidence he had walked in with. "Watch yourself, Valeria," he hissed under his breath. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Valeria chuckled. Oh, but she did. With a flick of her wrist, she pulled out another sleek envelope. This one heavier, thicker. The contents inside would be the final nail in the coffin of the Knight Empire. She held it up between two fingers, letting the room take it in, before handing it off to Gerald Sinclair, the banking regulator. "This," she announced, "is a detailed record of financial misconduct, tax evasion, and corporate fraud, all tied directly to Knight Enterprises. Offshore accounts, falsified financial reports, insider trading." "Shall I go on?" Gasps erupted across the room. A few guests physically stepped back as if merely being in proximity to Jonathan Knight could stain them. Gerald Sinclair's face hardened as he flipped through the documents. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath, before looking up sharply at Jonathan. "You've been laundering money through your firm for years." Jonathan visibly swallowed, but his arrogance wouldn't let him crumble yet. He squared his shoulders, turning his glare toward Valeria. "This is a pathetic attempt at revenge." He spat. "No one here is going to believe the bitter daughter who was thrown out years ago." Valeria laughed. It was a light, almost delighted sound. "You're right," she said, nodding. "They wouldn't just take my word for it." Then she turned to Gerald. "But I think they'll believe the SEC." The weight of that single statement sucked the air from the room. Jonathan staggered. For the first time, real panic flashed across his face. You didn't." "Oh, I did." Valeria cut in smoothly, relishing the way her father visibly stiffened. "They've had these files for weeks. I just wanted the pleasure of watching your world collapse firsthand." A hushed murmur spread across the ballroom. A mixture of shock, fear, and disbelief. Investors, colleagues, and former allies of Jonathan were already stepping away from him, as if he was toxic. His wife, Eleanor, finally spoke, her voice sharp with barely restrained fury. "You little snake," she hissed at Valeria, gripping her champagne glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You would ruin your own family?" Valeria's smile didn't waver. She leaned in slightly, her voice silk and steel. "You ruined it yourselves." Gerald stepped forward, his phone in hand. "We're going to need you to come in for questioning." "Jonathan." Jonathan's face contorted, rage and desperation warring beneath the surface. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice dripping with venom. Valeria's eyes gleamed as she took a slow sip of her champagne. "Oh, Dad," she whispered, watching as the security officers began to move toward him. "It already is." The moment hung in the air, thick with the weight of Jonathan Knight's downfall. The man who once ruled the financial world with an iron grip, who built his legacy on power and deception, now stood exposed, humiliated, and cornered. His carefully constructed empire, the one he had sacrificed everything for, including his own daughter, was unraveling before his very eyes. And Valeria? She was the one holding the strings. She took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Every movement deliberate. She could feel the eyes of the entire ballroom on her, their whispers like static in the background. But her focus remained on the man before her, the man who had cast her aside as if she were nothing. "I should thank you, really," Valeria mused, tilting her head slightly, "because if you hadn't thrown me out all those years ago, I might have spent my life trying to prove myself to you. Instead, I spent it preparing for this moment." Jonathan glared at her, his face twisted with barely concealed rage. But the tension in his posture betrayed his fear. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You think this spectacle, is enough to destroy me?" He scoffed, attempting to regain his composure. "I have connections, power. You have nothing." Valeria's smirk was slow, sharp, merciless. "You're right," she said. "Just exposing your fraud isn't enough." She reached into her clutch, pulling out one last document, one final weapon. "That's why I made sure to alert the IRS." Silence. Jonathan froze, the color drained from his face, his body going rigid as if he had been struck. The whispers around the ballroom grew louder, gasps of realization rippling through the crowd. The IRS. Valeria's voice was quiet, almost mocking. You thought you could move money through offshore accounts, falsify tax records, hide your wealth in shell companies? She let out a soft chuckle. Daddy, you should have been more careful. She turned slightly, her gaze landing on Gerald Sinclair, the banking regulator, who was now on the phone. Nodding curtly, I believe an official audit is already underway. Isn't it, Gerald? Gerald lifted his head, expression grim. It's worse than that, he confirmed, sliding his phone into his pocket. The IRS has been reviewing Knight Enterprises for months. With these additional records, he exhaled, shaking his head. You're looking at severe tax fraud, money laundering, and federal charges. Jonathan, there's no coming back from this. Panic flashed across Jonathan's face. He turned to his wife, Eleanor, but she was silent now, her face stone cold, her calculating mind already working through the implications. She had always prided herself on being untouchable. But tonight, that illusion was crumbling along with their empire. Sophia, who had remained in stunned, horrified silence, suddenly let out a strangled sob. Dad, she whispered, looking between him and the guests who were now openly watching their collapse. But Jonathan didn't respond. He was too busy watching his world burn. Valeria took one last sip of champagne, savoring the moment. She had waited 14 years for this. For justice, for freedom, and now, as security moved in, as Jonathan Knight was escorted away, as his reign of deception came to an end, she finally felt it. Relief. She had won. The cool night air wrapped around Valeria as she stepped out of the grand ballroom. The echoes of the chaos she left behind still lingering in the air. Inside, the once mighty Jonathan Knight was being swarmed by security and legal officials. His empire crumbling beneath the weight of his own crimes. Sophia had collapsed into a sobbing mess. And Eleanor, ever the Ice Queen, had simply stood in silence, watching the life she so carefully curated turn to dust. The Knight name, their legacy, was finished. And Valeria? She was free. As she reached the valet station, a familiar presence fell into step beside her. Ethan Hale, her husband, always calm, always steady. He didn't need to ask if she was okay, he already knew. Instead, he simply laced his fingers through hers. A silent, grounding touch. That was quite the show, he murmured, his voice laced with amusement. Valeria exhaled, tilting her head toward him with a small, satisfied smile. 14 years in the making. Ethan smirked. Worth it? She thought about it, about the years spent climbing, fighting, proving herself in a world that had ridden her off. About the girl she had once been, the girl standing in the rain outside a mansion. Shivering, lost, unwanted, she had worked for this moment. But revenge was never really the goal. No, freedom was. And now, standing here, beneath the city lights, with everything she built on her own terms, she finally had it. Valeria squeezed Ethan's hand. More than worth it. The valet pulled up in front of them, and as they slid into the sleek black car, Ethan glanced over, a knowing glint in his eyes. So, he said casually, cake? Valeria blinked, startled, then laughed. A deep, unguarded laugh, the kind she hadn't allowed herself in years. Yes, she said, still grinning, let's get some cake. Because tonight wasn't about them. It was about her, and for the first time in her life, she felt light, completely and utterly free. The story of Valeria Knight teaches a powerful lesson about resilience, self-worth, and justice. It proves that success is the best revenge, not through spite, but through becoming untouchable. Valeria didn't seek vengeance out of hatred, she sought freedom from her past. She refused to let betrayal define her, using it as fuel to build an empire on her own terms. The story reminds us that strength comes not from where we come from, but from what we choose to become. In the end, those who underestimate you will watch as you rise far beyond their reach.